Today we have a story about two sisters whose extraordinary abilities became both their blessing and their curse in the years following the war between the states. This account, drawn from letters and testimonies preserved in the Wayfield County archives, reveals a chapter of history that challenges everything we thought we knew about the pellucid limits of human perception. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. From the testimony of Ruth Michaels, recorded in 1870, my sister Naomi and I were born on the same night in 1862, during a winter so cold that water froze in the well before dawn. Mama said we came into the world holding hands, and perhaps that was the first sign of what we would become to each other, two halves of something that should not have been divided. We grew up in Wayfield, a town that had pulled itself back together after the war, like a quilt, with new patches sewn over the halls. Papa worked at the lumber mill, and Mama took in sewing. We lived in a small house on Riverside Street, and our childhood was filled with the ordinary joys and sorrows that all children know. But Naomi and I were different in ways that became impossible to hide. We could speak to each other without words, not in the vague way that close siblings sometimes do, finishing each other's sentences or knowing moods. No, we could hear each other's thoughts as clearly as spoken language. If Naomi burned her hand on the stove, I felt the pain in my own palm. When I dreamed, she dreamed the same dreams, seeing the same images unfold behind her sleeping eyes. At first, Mama thought it was simply the natural bond of twins. But as we grew older, 7, then 8, then 9 years old, the truth became undeniable. We could find lost objects by closing our eyes and feeling for them together. We knew when Papa would return from work before his footsteps sounded on the porch. Once, when our younger brother Thomas fell through the ice on Miller's Pond, we both woke screaming his name at the exact moment. Though we slept in separate rooms and the pond was 2 miles distant, Mama made us promise to keep our gift quiet. People fear what they cannot understand, she told us, her hands gripping ours with uncommon firmness, and fear makes them cruel. We tried to obey. We learned to pretend surprise when we already knew things. We spoke aloud when we could have been silent. We hid the truth behind ordinary words and careful expressions. But secrets, I have learned, are like water seeping through a dam. Eventually, they find the cracks. The trouble began when Mr. Edmund Ashworth came to Wayfield in the spring of 1870. He was a man of education and means. Having made his fortune in railroads and mining interests in the West, he purchased the old Grayson estate on the hill overlooking the town. A sprawling house with more rooms than seemed decent for a single man, and set about transforming it into what he called an institute for scientific inquiry. Mr. Ashworth was tall and lean, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they observed. He dressed in fine black suits and carried himself with the certainty of a man who had never been told no. Within weeks of his arrival, he had charmed the town council, donated funds to repair the church roof, and established himself as Wayfield's most distinguished citizen. He took particular interest in unusual phenomena. He collected specimens of rare minerals, preserved insects in jars of amber fluid, and filled his library with books on mesmerism, phrenology, and the mysteries of the human mind. The townspeople found him eccentric but harmless, a wealthy gentleman with peculiar hobbies. Mama's instinct was to keep us far from Mr. Ashworth's attention, but fate, or perhaps something darker, had other plans. It was a Sunday in late April, when our gift revealed itself in a way that could not be concealed. Naomi and I were walking home from church with our family when we both stopped simultaneously on the road, our heads turning in unison toward the woods at the edge of town. Without speaking, we began to run. Papa called after us, but we could not stop. We felt it a pull, an urgency, a knowledge that something terrible waited in those trees. We found little Margaret Foster trapped in an abandoned well, 30 feet down in darkness and cold water. She had been missing for 2 days. The town had searched everywhere except this forgotten place, hidden by brambles and thyme. We led the men there. They pulled Margaret out alive. Mr. Ashworth was among the crowd that gathered. I remember the way he watched us, not with gratitude or wonder, but with the calculating gaze of a man who has discovered something valuable. 3 days later, he called upon our parents with a proposition that would change everything. Mr. Ashworth arrived at our home on a Thursday evening, when the light was fading and Mama was preparing supper. He knocked with 3 precise raps, and Papa, never comfortable with men of wealth, Hansard with his hat in his hands despite being in his own house. "Mr. Michaels, Mrs. Michaels," Mr. Ashworth said, removing his own hat with practiced courtesy. "I hope I am not intruding. I have come with a matter of some importance regarding your daughters." Mama's hand tightened on the back of Papa's chair, but she nodded for him to enter. Mr. Ashworth sat in our small parlor, looking entirely out of place among our simple furniture, yet somehow making the room seem smaller by his presence. "Your daughters possess a remarkable gift," he began, his voice smooth as riverstones. "What they demonstrated on Sunday, the rescue of the foster child, suggests abilities that science has long theorized but rarely documented. I would like to study these abilities. With your permission, of course." "Study?" Papa's voice was wary. "What manner of study?" "Nothing invasive or unpleasant, I assure you. Simple tests of perception and cognition. I would compensate your family handsomely, $5 per week, plus educational opportunities for the girls. They would attend my institute 3 afternoons each week. Under the most respectable conditions, Mrs. Pemberton, the pastor's widow, would serve as chaperone." $5 per week was more than Papa earned in a fortnight at the mill. I saw the conflict in his eyes, the need warring with the instinct that something was wrong. "The girls have their schooling," Mama said quietly, "and their duties at home. The sessions would not interfere with their education. Indeed, I would provide additional tutoring in mathematics, literature, and the sciences. Your daughters would gain advantages rarely afforded to." He paused, choosing his words with care. 2 young women of limited means. The insult was wrapped in velvet, but it was an insult nonetheless. Naomi and I sat on the stairs, listening, our minds touching in that way that needed no words. We both felt the same thing, coldness emanating from Mr. Ashworth, like winter air seeping under a door. Papa looked to Mama. Some conversation passed between them in glances that we could not interpret. Even with our gift, finally, Papa spoke. "We will consider your offer, Mr. Ashworth, but we will not give our answer tonight." Mr. Ashworth smiled, though the expression did not reach his eyes. "Of course, I would expect nothing less from thoughtful parents. However, I should mention that the foster family has expressed extraordinary gratitude for the return of their daughter. They have been vocal in the town about the remarkable nature of the rescue. Interest in your daughter's abilities is growing." The threat was delicate but unmistakable. He was saying that if we did not accept his protection, his study, his control, then others would come asking. Others who might not be so generous or so discreet. After he left, Mama and Papa argued in whispers that carried through the thin walls. Papa wanted to refuse. Mama, more practical, pointed out that $5 per week could mean a better winter, shoes that fit, medicine if someone took sick, and perhaps, she said, it would be safer to have Mr. Ashworth's approval than his displeasure. In the end, poverty made the decision that fear could not. We began attending the institute the following Monday. The first sessions seemed harmless enough. Mr. Ashworth would separate Naomi and me into different rooms, then ask us to identify objects. The other was viewing cards with symbols, colored blocks, written words. We succeeded far more often than chance would allow, and he recorded everything in leather-bound journals with meticulous care. Mrs. Pemberton sat in the corner doing needlework, a comfortable presence that made the strangeness feel almost ordinary. But by the 3rd week, the tests changed. Mr. Ashworth began introducing discomfort into the experiments. He would place Naomi's hand in ice water and ask if I could feel the cold. He would sound a loud bell next to my ear and observe if Naomi flinched in the other room. The sessions grew longer, stretching from 1 hour to 2, then 3. "Science requires rigor," he would say when we showed signs of fatigue. "Greatness demands sacrifice." Mrs. Pemberton stopped attending after the first month. Mr. Ashworth explained that her services were no longer necessary, as our parents had given full consent and the tests were purely academic in nature. When Mama asked why, Mr. Ashworth smiled and increased our family's payment to $7 per week. Mama stopped asking questions. It was during the 6th week that I noticed the lock. We had always entered the institute through the front door, conducting our sessions in the ground floor parlor, but one afternoon, Mr. Ashworth led us upstairs to what he called his primary laboratory, a large room with curtained windows and strange equipment. I could not name. As we climbed the stairs, I saw that the door to the 3rd floor was secured with a heavy iron lock, new and out of place in the old house. "What is kept up there?" I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it. Mr. Ashworth paused, his hand on the railing. When he turned to look at me, his eyes held something I had not seen before, something eager and hungry. "Records," he said simply. "Very old records. Nothing that concerns you." But Naomi and I both heard it, the lie beneath the words, loud as a shout in our shared consciousness. That night, lying in our bed with our hands clasped between us, Naomi whispered a question into the darkness. "Ruth, what if we are not the first?" I did not answer, because I had been thinking the same thing, and because, somewhere in the house on the hill, behind that locked door, I felt certain that something was waiting, something that knew we were coming, something that had been waiting for a very long time. The spring turned to summer, and our sessions at the Institute became as regular as the church bells that marked the hours. We grew accustomed to Mr. Ashworth's tests, though they never ceased to exhaust us. Some days, when we walked home in the long evening light, Naomi and I would lean on each other like old women, our gifts stretched thin by hours of forced demonstration. But we said nothing to Mama and Papa. The money kept coming, and with it, small luxuries that eased the hardness of our lives: fresh meat on Sundays, a new coat for Thomas, medicine when Papa's cough persisted through July. It was the silence that first troubled me, not the absence of sound, but rather the particular quality of quiet that settled over Wayfield House during our sessions. The building was large, with servants who should have been moving through the halls, yet we never encountered them on the upper floors. No footsteps sounded overhead, no doors opened or closed in distant rooms. It was as though the house held its breath. When we arrived, I began to notice other details: marks on the walls of the laboratory, fence scratches near the baseboards, as though something had clawed there. The windows, always curtained, were locked from the outside with small brass fixtures that seemed designed to keep people in rather than out, and the air itself carried a strange weight, particularly near the door to the third floor, where that iron lock hung like a promise of secrets. Naomi felt it too. We did not need to speak of it aloud. Our shared consciousness hummed with unease. It was young Daniel Foster who provided the first piece of the larger puzzle. We encountered him at the general store one Saturday morning, and his mother pulled him close when she saw us, as though our gift might be contagious. "Strange business, what you girls do," she said, her voice carrying across the store, "though I suppose we should be grateful, considering Margaret." "My sister is well?" Naomi asked politely. Mrs. Foster's expression softened slightly. "She is, though she has nightmares still, dreams of being in darkness, unable to breathe." She paused, then added in a lower voice, "She says she heard singing while she was in that well. A girl's voice, singing the same song over and over, but there was no one else down there." The words sent ice through my veins. Naomi's hand found mine, and I felt her fear mirror my own. That night, we tried to refuse the Monday session, feigning illness, but Mama, seeing the payment envelope growing lighter as expenses continued, would hear none of it. "Mr. Ashworth has been generous," she said firmly. "We will not insult him with deception. Whatever troubles you, pray on it. God does not give us burdens we cannot bear." But I was not certain God had anything to do with what waited in that house. Monday came, and with it, a change in Mr. Ashworth's routine. He led us not to the laboratory, but to his library, a dark panelled room lined with books and specimens in glass cases. He dismissed us earlier than usual, saying he had business in town, but as we gathered our shawls, he made an unusual request. "Before you leave, would you girls be so kind as to retrieve my journal from the laboratory? I find I have forgotten it, and my knees trouble me on the stairs." It was a small thing, a reasonable request, yet every instinct the first possessed screamed against it. "Of course, Mr. Ashworth," I heard myself say, because what else could I say? We climbed the stairs alone for the first time. The house seemed to expand around us, the shadows growing deeper, the silence more profound. When we reached the laboratory door, I noticed that it stood slightly ajarsome than Mr. Ashworth always prevented, insisting that his equipment required specific conditions. Naomi pushed it open, and we stepped inside. The journal lay on the central table, exactly where Mr. Ashworth said it would be, but as I reached for it, my eyes caught on something else, a sheaf of papers that had slipped partially from beneath a leather portfolio. I should not have looked. I knew this, even as my hand moved to shift the papers into view, but curiosity, or perhaps something darker, compelled me. The top sheet bore a heading in Mr. Ashworth's precise script: Subject 7, Final Observations. Below it, a date, April 1860-8. And below that, 2 names, Abigail and Ann Thompson, aged 12 years. My breath stopped. Naomi moved to my side, and together we read the words that followed: clinical descriptions of tests similar to ours, measurements of response times and accuracy rates, notes on the subject's increasing fatigue and resistance. The final entry was dated June 1868. Subjects proved unable to maintain separation beyond 48 hours. Experiment concluded. Specimens preserved for future reference. Specimens, the word hung in the air like smoke. We heard footsteps on the stairs, quick, purposeful, ascending. Naomi grabbed my hand, and we ran, not toward the main staircase where the footsteps approached, but toward the servants' stairs at the back of the hall. We had never used them, had been told they were unsafe, but fear drove us forward. We burst through a narrow door and found ourselves in a cramped stairwell that climbed upward into darkness. The footsteps behind us quickened, and we heard Mr. Ashworth's voice, calm and measured. "Girls, there is no need for alarm. Come down, please." But we went up instead, driven by an instinct we did not question. The stairs ended at another door, the door with the iron lock, except now, impossibly, it stood open. The room beyond was dark, save for moonlight filtering through a single uncurtained window. As our eyes adjusted, we saw them, glass cases lining the walls, each containing objects suspended in clear fluid. But these were not insects or geological samples. They were organs, human organs, preserved and labeled, and in the case nearest the window, illuminated by pale light, floated to small hearts connected by a thin strand of tissue fused together, beating as one. The label read, Abigail and Ann Thompson. Cardiac specimens, 1868. Behind us, Mr. Ashworth's footsteps reached the top of the stairs. "Ah," he said softly, and I heard satisfaction in his voice. "I see you have found my collection. How extraordinary that you knew to come here. Your gift truly is remarkable." We turned to face him, our backs against the window, our hands clasped so tightly I could feel Naomi's pulse through her palm. Perhaps it was my own pulse. Impossible to distinguish. Mr. Ashworth stood in the doorway, blocking our escape. In the moonlight, his face held no anger, only the clinical interest of a man observing a particularly fascinating specimen. "You understand now, I suppose," he said. "The Thompson girls were my first successor twins, connected not merely by birth but by physiology. When they died regrettably, due to my imperfect understanding at that time, I preserved what I could. But I have learned so much since then." He smiled. "With you two, I will not make the same mistakes." The room seemed to tilt. Naomi's fear flooded through our connection, amplifying my own until I could barely stand. "We are leaving," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Our parents expect us. Your parents believe you are participating in academic study. They will be told you are staying late for additional tutoring. No one will come looking for you until morning, and by then, we will have learned so very much together." He stepped into the room, and as he did, I noticed something, a flicker of candlelight on the floor below, visible through the narrow gap beneath the door. Someone else was in the house, someone moving on the second floor. Naomi saw it too. Our minds touched, sharing a desperate plan. "Mr. Ashworth," Naomi said suddenly, her voice breaking with false tears, "I feel faint. The shock, it is too much. Please, I need water." He hesitated, torn between his scientific curiosity and the inconvenience of a swooning subject. Finally, he stepped back. "Stay here. I will return momentarily." The moment he descended the stairs, we moved, not toward the servants' stairs, but toward the main staircase, running faster than we had ever run. We heard Mr. Ashworth's shout behind us, heard his feet pounding in pursuit. We burst through the front door into the twilight, and there, coming up the path with a lantern, was Pastor Fairmont. "Help us," I screamed, and the pastor's eyes widened in alarm. Mr. Ashworth appeared in the doorway behind us, composing his features into a mask of concern. "Pastor, thank goodness you have arrived. The girls have had a terrible fright. They wandered into an area of the house. They should not have entered and misunderstood what they saw. I was just trying to calm them." Pastor Fairmont looked between us and Mr. Ashworth, uncertainty clear on his weathered face. "He has hearts in jars," Naomi said, her voice shaking. "Human hearts, from 2 girls, from the Thompson twins." The name seemed to strike Pastor Fairmont like a physical blow. His face went pale. "The Thompson girls," he whispered, "from Granville. "A tragic case," Mr. Ashworth said smoothly. "They died of fever. I acquired the specimens for research with the family's permission. The girls here have simply the Thompson girls disappeared," Pastor Fairmont said slowly, his voice gaining strength. "In the summer of their father came to me, begging for help, searching. They were never found." The silence that followed was absolute. Pastor Fairmont raised his lantern higher, and in its light, I saw Mr. Ashworth's mask finally slip, revealing something cold and ancient and utterly without conscience. "Take the girls home," the pastor said. "I will summon the sheriff." We did not wait to hear Mr. Ashworth's response. We ran down the hill toward town, toward light and people and safety, while behind us, the house on the hill stood dark and silent, keeping its secrets still. But we knew now that we were not the first, and somewhere in that building, other specimens waited in their glass cases, other children who had possessed gifts that made them valuable to a man who saw people as objects to be studied and preserved. The question that haunted our dreams that night was simple and terrible. How many others had there been? The sheriff came before dawn, bringing with him 3 deputies and a righteous anger that seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. Papa went with them, over Mama's protests, because he said he needed to see with his own eyes what had been done under the guise of science and education. Naomi and I stayed home, huddled together in our bed, neither of us sleeping. Through the window, we watched the sky pale from black to gray to the thin blue of early morning. We did not need to speak. Our shared consciousness was a tumult of fear and relief, and a strange, gnawing guilt, as though, by surviving, we had somehow failed the others who had not. The men returned as the church bells struck 9. Papa's face was grey as ash, and he would not meet Mama's eyes when he entered the house. "It is true," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "God help us, it is all true." They had found the 3rd floor, exactly as we described, at the glass cases, the preserved organs, the meticulous labels spanning more than a decade, 7 sets of specimens in total, each labeled with names, dates, and locations. The Thompson twins from Grantville, the Chen sisters from a mining camp in the Western Territories, others whose names meant nothing to us but surely meant everything to the families who had lost them. They had also found journals, years upon years of observations, experiments, theories about the nature of twin consciousness, and the physical manifestations of psychic connection. Mr. Ashworth had documented everything with the precision of a man who saw his subjects not as children, but as opportunities for discovery. But Mr. Ashworth himself was gone. The servants, questioned by the sheriff, claimed to know nothing of the 3rd floor. They had been instructed never to enter it, told it contained dangerous chemicals and valuable equipment. They had obeyed without question, because Mr. Ashworth paid well and asked little else of them. A search of the town revealed that Mr. Ashworth had departed on the midnight train, carrying only a single leather case. No one knew where he had gone. The railroad clerk remembered him purchasing a ticket to Richmond, but whether that was his true destination, none could say. The town erupted in horror and speculation. How had such a monster hidden among them for so long? How had no one suspected? The church ladies whispered that they had always found him strange. The men at the mill claimed they had never trusted his smooth manners and generous donations. Everyone, it seemed, had known something was wrong, but only after it was safe to say so. Our family became the subject of intense scrutiny. Some praised our courage in exposing Mr. Ashworth's crimes. Others suggested, in voices barely low enough to be called whispers, that perhaps we had known all along and said nothing. After all, we had accepted his money for months. We had gone willingly to that house, week after week. The guilt they implied was the same guilt that gnawed at us in the dark hours before dawn. It was on the 3rd day after the discovery that Reverend Fairmont called a town meeting at the church. Every family in Wayfield attended, packing the pews until people stood along the walls and in the aisles. The air was thick with summer heat and the smell of too many bodies pressed too close together. Reverend Fairmont stood at the pulpit, his face grave. "We are gathered," he began, "to discuss a matter that concerns us all. The evil that was perpetrated in our midst has been exposed, but questions remain. Questions about culpability and knowledge. Questions about the nature of the gifts possessed by the Michaels girls." My blood ran cold. Beside me, Naomi's hand found mine. "Some have suggested," the Reverend continued, "that gifts such as theirs are themselves unnatural, that they represent a deviation from God's intended order, that their very existence invites darkness." A murmur of agreement rippled through the congregation. "I have prayed on this matter," Reverend Fairmont said, "and searched the scriptures for guidance, and I have concluded that while we must be grateful for the revelation of Mr. Ashworth's sins, we must also consider what it means to harbor such unusual abilities in our community." Mama stood suddenly, her voice ringing out clear and strong in a way I had never heard before. "Reverend Fairmont, are you suggesting that my daughters are responsible for what that man did?" "I am suggesting, Mrs. Michaels, that we must be cautious, that perhaps it would be best if certain elements that attract darkness were to remove themselves from our midst." The meaning was clear. They wanted us gone. Papa rose beside Mama, his jaw set. "My daughters saved Margaret Foster's life. They exposed a killer who had been welcomed into your homes, given your trust and admiration. And now you would cast them out because you fear what you do not understand." "We fear what is unnatural," someone called from the back of the church. "What goes against the Lord's design?" "Nothing about my children goes against the Lord," Mama said, and her voice shook with a fury I had never witnessed. "They were born as God made them, with gifts He chose to give them. If you cannot see the blessing in that, then perhaps it is your souls that need examining, not theirs." The church erupted in argument, voices raised in accusation and defense, fears and prejudices spilling out like poison from a lanced wound. Through it all, Naomi and I sat silent, our hands clasped, feeling the weight of every suspicious glance, every whispered condemnation. It was then that I saw him. At the back of the church, partially obscured by the crowd, stood a man in a fine black suit. Even at that distance, even with his face half shadowed, I recognized the silver-streaked hair, the calculating eyes. Mr. Ashworth had returned. I gripped Naomi's hand tighter, and she gasped. She had seen him too. Our shared consciousness screamed a warning, but before we could speak, he was gone, melting into the crowd like smoke. "He is here," I whispered to Papa, who bent close to hear me over the chaos. "Mr. Ashworth, he is in Wayfield." Papa's face went rigid. He pushed through the crowd toward the door, several other men following when they understood his urgency. But by the time they reached the street, there was no sign of Mr. Ashworth. The road was empty, save for a few scattered townsfolk making their way home. The sheriff, when summoned, organized a search of every building, every barn, every possible hiding place. They found nothing. That night, Mama and Papa moved our entire family into the church itself, where Reverend Fairmont, whatever his doubts about our gifts, could not deny us sanctuary. We slept on the floor with a dozen other families who had volunteered to stand watch, the men taking turns at the doors with whatever weapons they could find. But I could not sleep. I lay in the darkness, feeling Mr. Ashworth's presence like a shadow over the town. He had come back for something, and I knew with cold certainty what that something was. He had come back for us. Near midnight, as the church lay quiet save for the sounds of sleeping bodies and creaking pews, I felt it a pull, like a thread connecting my consciousness to something outside. Naomi felt it too. Our eyes met in the darkness, and I saw my own terror reflected there. The pull grew stronger, insistent, demanding. It was our gift, being twisted somehow, turned against us. Mr. Ashworth had studied us for months, learned the patterns of our connection, and now he was using that knowledge to call us to him. "We must not go," Naomi whispered. But even as she spoke, I felt my body begin to move, drawn by an imperative I could not name. Together, still holding hands, we rose and walked toward the church door. We passed Papa, sleeping with his back against the wall. We passed the men standing watch, who stared at us with confused expressions, but did not stop us, perhaps because we moved with such purpose, or perhaps because Mr. Ashworth's influence extended even to them. We stepped out into the night, and the door closed behind us with a soft click that sounded like a trap, springing shut. Mr. Ashworth waited in the shadows across the street, a darker shape against the darkness. "Come," he said simply, and we walked toward him, our bodies betraying us even as our minds screamed in protest. He led us through silent streets toward Wayfield House, and with each step I felt our will draining away, replaced by the certainty that we had always been meant for this, that our gifts were not our own, but something he had awakened in us, that we belonged to him, as surely as the specimens in his glass cases. We climbed the hill as the moon set behind clouds, and the house loomed before us, like a mouth waiting to swallow us whole. But as Mr. Ashworth reached for the door, I felt something else, a different kind of pull, coming not from him but from somewhere deeper, from the connection Naomi and I shared, yes, but also from something older, From the Thompson twins and the Chen sisters, and all the others who had been taken before us, they were not gone, I realized. Not entirely. They lived on in their preserved remains, in the evidence of their existence, in the very violations that had been committed against them, and they were angry. The door burst open of its own accord, and Mr. Ashworth stumbled backward in surprise. From inside the house came a sound high and terrible, like wind through a narrow passage, or like 7 pairs of lungs all drawing breath at once. Mr. Ashworth's control over us shattered like glass. "Run!" I gasped to Naomi, and we ran. Behind us, the house seemed to come alive, lights flickering in windows, doors slamming, and that terrible sound growing louder, more insistent. We heard Mr. Ashworth cry out, heard his footsteps as he fled, not after us, but into the house itself, as though seeking refuge from whatever had awakened there. We ran all the way back to the church, pounding on the door until it opened. Papa caught us as we fell through, and the men rushed past us toward the hill, where Wayfield House blazed with light despite the hour. They found Mr. Ashworth the next morning in his laboratory, collapsed on the floor amid shattered glass cases and spilled preservation fluid. He was alive, but something had broken in his mind. He could only repeat the same words over and over. They would not be silent. I told them to be silent, but they would not obey. The specimens were gone, the fluid drained, the organs vanished as though they had never existed. Only the labels remained, evidence of what had been taken. Mr. Ashworth was committed to an asylum in the state capital, where he remained until his death, 3 years later. He never spoke coherently again, though the doctors reported that he would sometimes wake screaming in the night, claiming that dead girls were singing to him in the darkness. As for Naomi and me, we carried the weight of that night for the rest of our lives. But we also carried something else, a gift that had proven itself stronger than any man's attempt to control it, and a connection that reached beyond death itself. We were not alone. We had never been alone, and the ones who came before us had made certain we would survive to tell their story. The week following Mr. Ashworth's collapse brought an invasion of officials to our small town. The state police arrived first, followed by men in fine suits who identified themselves as federal marshals, and finally, a delegation from the medical college in Baltimore who claimed jurisdiction over matters of scientific malfeasance. They interviewed everyone: the servants who had worked at Wayfield House, the shopkeepers who had sold Mr. Ashworth his supplies, the railroad clerks who had processed his shipments. They questioned Naomi and me for hours, asking us to recount every detail of our sessions, every test, every conversation. But what they truly wanted, we came to understand, was to prove that the missing specimens had been taken by human hands, that there was a rational explanation for their disappearance, for Mr. Ashworth's madness, for the events of that terrible night. They could not find one. The glass cases had been shattered from the inside, the glass blown outward, not inward. The preservation fluid had been drained through the floor, leaving stains that formed patterns too deliberate to be random spillage. And strangest of all, the labels had been carefully removed from each case and arranged on the laboratory table to spell out a single word: remember. The investigators had no answer for this. They wrote it up in their reports as vandalism committed by an unknown party, though even they seemed to doubt their own conclusions. It was during the second week of the investigation that we received an unexpected visitor. Her name was Elizabeth Morrison, and she had traveled from Grantville 3 days by train and carriage after reading about the discovery in the newspapers. She was the mother of Abigail and Anne. Thompson. Mama received her in our parlor, while Naomi and I sat quietly in the corner. Mrs. Morrison was a thin woman whose face spoke of years, lived in the shadow of grief. Her hands shook as she held the teacup Mama offered her. "I knew they were dead," she said softly. "I have known it for 5 years, but not knowing what happened to them, not being able to lay them to rest, it has been a torment beyond description." "I am so sorry," Mama said, and her voice carried a weight of understanding that came from imagining the same fate for her own daughters. Mrs. Morrison turned to look at Naomi and me. "You saw them, their remains?" I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. "Were they—" She paused, struggling with the question. "Were they treated with any dignity?" How could I answer that? I thought of the hearts floating in fluid, of the clinical labels, of Mr. Ashworth's journals describing Abigail and as though they were insects pinned to a board. But I also thought of that moment in the laboratory when we had felt something, a presence, an awareness, a connection that reached across death itself. "They were not forgotten," I said finally. and I believe they were not alone. They had each other, even in death. Mrs. Morrison closed her eyes, and tears slipped down her cheeks. They were never apart, she whispered. From the moment they were born, they would cry if you separated them. It was as though they shared one soul between two bodies. That is how we are, Naomi said quietly. That is our gift. Mrs. Morrison looked at her with an expression of such profound understanding that I felt it like a physical thing. Then you know, she said, you know what he took from them. Not just their lives, but their wholeness, their completeness. She reached into her bag and withdrew a small photograph in a tarnished frame. Two girls, perhaps 10 years old, sat close together on a bench. They were identical in every way, the same dark hair, the same solemn eyes, the same small hands clasped together. This was taken a month before they disappeared. Mrs. Morrison said, keep it, if you would. Let it remind you that they were real, that they were loved, that they mattered. Mama took the photograph with trembling hands. We will honor their memory, she promised. Mrs. Morrison stayed in Wayfield for 3 days, long enough to meet with the investigators and provide information about her daughters. She confirmed that Mr. Ashworth had visited Grantville in the spring of '68, presenting himself as a scholar of child development, interested in studying remarkable children. He had offered money, just as he had offered it to our parents, and the Morrisons, struggling to feed for children on a laborer's wages, had accepted. Abigail and Ad attended sessions at Mr. Ashworth's temporary residence for 6 weeks. Then, one evening, they had not come home. Mr. Ashworth had left Grantville the next morning, and no trace of the girls was ever found. Mrs. Morrison's testimony gave the investigators what they needed to connect Mr. Ashworth to other disappearances across 3 states. As news spread, other families came forward, parents who had lost twins, siblings who had lost sisters, whole communities that had been touched by unexplained vanishings. The pattern became clear. Mr. Ashworth had been traveling from town to town for more than 15 years, seeking out twins, particularly those who showed signs of unusual connection or ability. He would establish himself as a respectable gentleman, gain the trust of poor families desperate for opportunity, and then conduct his experiments until the children either died from his manipulations or disappeared entirely. We learned that the Huon sisters had not been from a mining camp at all, but from a small farming community in Oregon. Their parents had been immigrants, speaking little English, trusting the well-dressed white man who promised to educate their daughters. When the girls vanished, the parents had gone to the authorities, but their concerns were dismissed. Who would believe that a man of Mr. Ashworth's standing would harm children? The list grew longer with each passing week. Names, dates, locations, a trail of grief stretching back to the early 1850s. The investigators estimated that at least 20 pairs of twins had been subjected to Mr. Ashworth's experiments. Only 7 sets of remains had been found in Wayfield House. The fate of the others remained unknown. It was during this time that Naomi and I began experiencing strange phenomena. We would wake in the night feeling presences in our room, not threatening, but watching, waiting. Objects would move on their own. The photograph of Abigail and Anne would be face up on the table when we were certain we had placed it face down, or our own reflection in the mirror would seem slightly out of sync, as though we were seeing not ourselves but others who looked like us. We told no one except Pastor Fairmont, who listened with grave attention. I believe, he said carefully, that you have become connected to something larger than yourselves. The gift you share may have created a bridge not just between you and your sister, but between you and all those who came before. They recognize you as kin. What do they want from us? I asked, perhaps only what Mrs. Morrison wanted to be remembered, to have their truth told. It was then that I conceived the idea of creating a record, not just of our own experience, but of all the victims we could identify, a testament to their existence and their suffering, so that no one could ever claim ignorance or dismiss their deaths as mere tragedy. Naomi and I spent the autumn gathering information. We wrote letters to families, interviewed investigators, and compiled every scrap of evidence we could find. We recorded the names of the twins, their ages, their gifts, the circumstances of their disappearances. We included the few photographs that survived, sketches drawn from family descriptions, and excerpts from Mr. Ashworth's journals that documented his observations. The work was heartbreaking, but it felt necessary. Each name we wrote was a life we restored from obscurity. Each detail we preserved was a small act of justice. The town, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile its horror at Mr. Ashworth's crimes with its discomfort regarding Naomi and me. We were heroes who had exposed evil, yes, but we were also reminders of that evil, living proof that the inexplicable existed in their midst. Some families welcomed us warmly, others crossed the street to avoid us. The children who had once played with us now whispered and stared from a distance. It was Mrs. Harrison, the school teacher, who finally confronted the situation directly. She gathered the families at the schoolhouse one evening and spoke with the firm authority that came from 3 decades of managing unruly children. "These girls have done nothing wrong," she declared. "They have suffered and survived. They have shown more courage than most grown men in this town, and I will not tolerate any student in my classroom showing them anything less than respect and kindness. Is that understood?" The parents nodded, some reluctantly, others with relief that someone had finally said what needed saying. After that, the tension began to ease. We were not forgotten or forgiven. There was nothing to forgive. But we were gradually accepted as part of Wayfield's fabric once more. The girl whose gift had become entangled with tragedy, but who were ultimately just children trying to find their place in a world that did not always understand them. In December, a letter arrived from the State Attorney General's office. They were preparing charges against Mr. Ashworth, despite his condition, and wanted to know if Naomi and I would be willing to testify at a hearing. Papa was reluctant. "You have already endured so much," he said. "I will not force you to relive it publicly." But Naomi and I had discussed this possibility in the privacy of our shared consciousness. We knew what our answer would be. "We will testify," I said, "not for ourselves, but for Abigail and Anne, for the Chen sisters, for all the others who cannot speak. Someone must tell their story." Mama embraced us both, tears in her eyes. "You are braver than I ever was," she whispered. The hearing was scheduled for January, in the state capital. We would travel there with our parents, stay in a hotel paid for by the state, and give our testimony before a panel of judges who would determine whether Mr. Ashworth was competent to stand trial. As the date approached, Naomi and I felt the presences in our room growing stronger. They were not frightening, if anything. They felt almost protective, like older sisters watching over us. The night before we left for the capital, I woke to find the photograph of Abigail and Anne glowing faintly in the moonlight. I sat up, and Naomi stirred beside me, also awakened. In the mirror across the room, we saw not our own reflections, but theirs. Abigail and Anne, standing where we stood, wearing expressions of solemn gratitude. Then they were gone, and we were alone again in the ordinary darkness of our room. But we understood. The message: go, speak, remember us, and we would. The journey to the state capital took 2 days by train, and I had never been so far from Wayfield in all my life. The world seemed to expand around U.S. cities with buildings that reached toward the sky, crowds of strangers moving with purpose through busy streets, the constant noise of progress and industry. Naomi and I stayed close to each other, our hands linked, drawing strength from our connection as we always had. Mama and Papa flanked us like sentries, their faces set with determination that barely masked their anxiety. The hearing was held in a grand courthouse with marble floors and windows, so tall they seemed designed to let God himself peer in at the proceedings. We were escorted to a waiting room where other witnesses had gathered. Mrs. Morrison, looking frailer than when we had last seen her, 2 federal marshals who had investigated the Wayfield House, and a doctor from the asylum where Mr. Ashworth was held. The Attorney General, a severe man named Mr. Whitmore, explained what would happen. "The purpose of this hearing is to determine whether Mr. Edmund Ashworth is competent to stand trial for multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and scientific malfeasance. You will be asked to describe your experiences with the accused. Answer truthfully and completely. The judges will determine the rest." When our turn came, Naomi and I entered the hearing chamber together. 3 judges sat at an elevated bench, their faces impossible to read. Mr. Ashworth sat at a table with his attorney, a young man who looked deeply uncomfortable with his assignment. I had not seen Mr. Ashworth since that terrible night, and the change in him was profound. The confidence and cold calculation that had defined him were gone, replaced by a vacant stare and trembling hands. His hair had gone completely white, and his fine clothes hung on him as though he had shrunk inside them. Yet when his eyes met mine, I saw a flicker of something: recognition, perhaps, or hunger. Whatever had broken in his mind, some part of him still remembered us. Mr. Whitmore approached us gently, Ruth, Naomi, please tell the court how you came to meet Mr. Ashworth. I took a breath and began to speak. I told them about the rescue of Margaret Foster, about Mr. Ashworth's proposition to our parents, about the $5 per week that had seemed like salvation to a struggling family. I described the early sessions, the cards with symbols, the colored blocks, the tests that seemed harmless at first. Then I described how things changed. As I spoke, I watched the judges' faces shift from neutral attention to growing horror. When I mentioned the laboratory on the 3rd floor, the locked door, the glass cases with their preserved contents, one of the judges actually paled. "And what happened on the night of your final encounter with Mr. Ashworth?" Mr. Whitmore asked. This was the difficult part, the part that made us sound like hysterical girls, or, worse, like willing participants in something supernatural that reasonable men would not believe. But we had promised to tell the truth. Naomi spoke this time, her voice soft but steady. "He called us out of the church using our gift. He had studied how our minds connect, and he knew how to pull on that connection like a rope. We could not resist, even though we wanted to. He was taking us back to Wayfield House when she faltered, and I continued. When something stopped him, the house itself seemed to awaken. We felt the presence of the others, the girls he had killed. They were still there, somehow, and they were angry. They broke his hold over us, and we escaped." The chamber fell silent. I could see the skepticism on some faces, the discomfort on others. But Mrs. Morrison, sitting in the gallery, nodded with tears streaming down her face. Mr. Ashworth's attorney rose for cross-examination. He was careful, almost apologetic. "Ruth, Naomi, is it possible that you simply imagined these events? That the stress and fear of the situation caused you to misinterpret what was happening?" "No, sir," I said firmly. "We did not imagine the specimens in the glass cases. We did not imagine the journals documenting his experiments. And we did not imagine the fact that 7 pairs of twins disappeared over the course of 15 years, all after encountering Mr. Ashworth. But this business about being called by mental connection, about the house awakening, surely you must admit these sound like fantasies." Before I could answer, Mr. Ashworth spoke for the first time. His voice was a cracked whisper, but it carried in the silent chamber. "They tell the truth," he said. "They came when I called them. The connection between true twins, perfect specimens, can be manipulated if you understand the principles. I learned this through careful study. I learned it from the others before they expired." His attorney tried to silence him, but Mr. Ashworth continued, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the room. "But I did not understand everything. I did not know that the connection persists beyond death. I did not know they would wake up and remember. I told them to be silent. I commanded them, but they would not obey." The judges exchanged glances. One of them leaned forward. "Mr. Ashworth, are you saying that you caused the deaths of multiple children in pursuit of scientific knowledge?" "They were specimens," Mr. Ashworth said, as though this explained everything. "Remarkable specimens. Their gifts made them valuable beyond measure. It was necessary to understand the mechanism, to preserve the evidence of what was possible. Science requires sacrifice." "These were children," the judge said, his voice hard. "Human beings with families who loved them." Mr. Ashworth tilted his head, confused. "But they were connected. They were different. Surely you understand the importance of documenting such anomalies before they are lost." The hearing chamber erupted. Spectators shouted from the gallery. Mr. Ashworth's attorney looked as though he wished the floor would open and swallow him. The judges called for order, pounding their gavels until the noise subsided. Mrs. Morrison stood, her voice cutting through the chaos. "My daughters had names, Abigail and Anne. They were 9 years old. They liked to sing together and help me in the garden. They were not specimens. They were my children." Mr. Ashworth looked at her with genuine puzzlement. "Yes, I recall them. Excellent subjects. Their cardiac tissue showed remarkable synchronization. The preservation was not perfect. My techniques were still developing, but the specimens yielded valuable data." Mrs. Morrison collapsed back into her seat, sobbing. The judge who had questioned Mr. Ashworth removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. "I believe we have heard enough," he said quietly. "This hearing is adjourned. The panel will deliberate and deliver a finding within the week." As we left the chamber, reporters swarmed us, shouting questions. Papa pushed through them, shielding Naomi and me with his body. But one question carried above the others. "Girls, do you believe the house was truly haunted by the victims?" I turned back, and in that moment, I felt them again, not just Abigail and Anne, but all of them. The Chen sisters. the others whose names we had discovered, and those whose names remained lost. They clustered around us like a congregation, invisible but present. Yes, I said clearly. I believe they were there. I believe they are still there, waiting for justice. And I believe they will not rest until their story is known. The reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. The story would be in every paper by morning, not just the facts of Mr. Ashworth's crimes, but the supernatural elements that would make sensible people shake their heads and dismiss us as hysterical girls with overactive imaginations. But we knew the truth, and truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. The panel delivered their finding 3 days later. Mr. Edmund Ashworth was competent to stand trial. Despite his obvious mental deterioration, his confession at the hearing, combined with the physical evidence and testimony from multiple witnesses, was sufficient to proceed with prosecution. The trial was scheduled for March. We returned to Wayfield as the first snow of the season began to fall. The town had changed in our absence, or perhaps we had changed, and saw it differently now. The ordinary rhythms of life continued, but we carried with us the weight of what we had witnessed. That night, in our shared room, Naomi and I held hands in the darkness and felt the presences around us stronger than ever before. They were not demanding or frightening. They simply were a reminder that we had become their voice, their witnesses, their memorial. We did the right thing, Naomi whispered. Yes, I agreed, but it is not finished yet, because Mr. Ashworth would stand trial, and we would have to testify again, this time before a jury of ordinary people who would determine his fate. And somewhere in that courtroom, the truth of what he had done would either be acknowledged and punished, or dismissed as the ravings of damaged minds and suggestible girls. We would not know which until the trial concluded, but we would be there. We would speak for those who could not speak for themselves, and we would remember, always, that we were not alone. The trial of Edmund Ashworth began on the 15th of March, 1873, in the main courthouse of the state capital. The gallery was packed with spectators, reporters from newspapers as far away as New York and Boston, families of the victims, curious citizens drawn by the sensational nature of the case, and those who simply wanted to witness a monster brought to account. Naomi and I sat with our parents in a reserved section, wearing our best dresses, which Mama had sewn especially for the occasion. We looked like any other respectable young women, and perhaps that was the point, to show the jury that we were not strange creatures or unreliable witnesses, but ordinary girls who had survived something extraordinary. The prosecution, led by Mr. Whitmore, laid out the case with methodical precision. They presented the physical evidence, photographs of the laboratory, the preserved specimens, pages from Mr. Ashworth's journals detailing his experiments. They called witnesses who testified to the disappearances of twins across multiple states, always following Mr. Ashworth's presence in a community. The medical examiner from Baltimore testified about the remains found at Wayfield House, confirming that they were human organs preserved with chemical solutions. He described the level of skill required to perform such preservation, indicating that whoever had done this work possessed significant anatomical knowledge. Mrs. Morrison testified, as did the parents of 3 other sets of victims. Their testimony was devastating in its simplicity. They described children who had been loved and missed, normal family life shattered by disappearance, years spent searching for answers that never came. The defense attorney, Mr. Phillips, tried to suggest that Mr. Ashworth was insane, that his actions were the result of a diseased mind rather than criminal intent. He called psychiatrists who testified about various forms of madness, about obsessions and compulsions that could drive a man to irrational acts, but the prosecution countered with evidence of Mr. Ashworth's careful planning, the way he selected victims from poor families who were unlikely to pursue legal action, the care he took to establish respectable identities in each town, the meticulous records he kept that showed full awareness of what he was doing. This is not madness, Mr. Whitmore argued. This is evil disguised as science. This is a man who believed his intellectual curiosity gave him the right to destroy children for the sake of his research. On the 5th day of the trial, Naomi and I were called to testify. The courtroom fell silent as we took the stand together. The judge had ruled that, given the nature of our connection, we could testify jointly, each supplementing the other's account as needed. Mr. Whitmore approached us with the same gentleness he had shown at the hearing. Ruth, Naomi, please tell the jury about your gift. Help them understand what makes you different. I glanced at Naomi, and she nodded. We had practiced this, had discussed how to explain something that defied easy explanation. "We are connected," I began, "in a way that goes beyond ordinary sisterhood. We can feel each other's emotions, sometimes share thoughts without speaking. When one of us is hurt, the other feels pain. We are two people, but also something more, something that exists in the space between us." "And Mr. Ashworth was interested in this connection?" Mr. Whitmore prompted. "Yes," Naomi said. "He wanted to understand it, to measure it, to document it. At first, his tests were simple, but they became increasingly invasive as he tried to push the boundaries of what we could do." I described the sessions in detail, the separation, the discomfort, the way Mr. Ashworth would introduce pain or stress to see how it affected our connection. The jury listened with expressions ranging from horror to fascination. "Did Mr. Ashworth ever explain what he hoped to achieve with these experiments?" Mr. Whitmore asked. "He spoke of understanding the nature of consciousness," I said. "He believed that twins like us proved that the mind was not confined to a single body, that there were connections between people that science had not yet discovered. He wanted to be the first to document these connections conclusively. And what was he willing to do to achieve this goal?" Naomi and I exchanged a glance, our minds touching in that familiar way. Then we spoke together, our voices overlapping. "Anything." The effect was startling even to us. The jury members shifted uncomfortably, several exchanging nervous glances. We had not planned this simultaneous speech, but our connection had made it natural. "Inevitable." Mr. Whitmore let the moment hang before continuing. "Did you discover what happened to the children who came before you?" "We did," I said. "We found their remains preserved in Mr. Ashworth's laboratory. We also found his journals, which documented their deaths." "Were these deaths accidental?" "No," Naomi said firmly. "Mr. Ashworth wrote that some subjects proved too fragile for extended observation. Others expired during attempts to physically examine the connecting tissue. He documented their deaths with the same dispassionate tone he used for all his observations." A woman in the gallery gasped. The judge called for silence. Mr. Phillips rose for cross-examination, but his approach was cautious. He knew that attacking us too aggressively would alienate the jury. "Ruth, Naomi, you have described a connection between you that is, frankly, difficult for many people to accept. Is it possible that Mr. Ashworth believed he was conducting legitimate scientific research, that he did not intend harm?" "He knew he was causing harm," I said. "He wrote about the pain his subjects experienced. He noted their fear, their attempts to resist. He simply did not care, because he valued his research above their lives." "But surely he told us we were specimens," Naomi interrupted, her voice sharp. "He said science requires sacrifice. He kept human organs in jars as though they were butterflies pinned to a board. He knew exactly what he was doing." Mr. Phillips tried another approach. "The events you described, the house awakening, the sense of presences, these sound like the products of traumatized minds. Is it possible you simply imagined the specimens disappeared?" I said coldly. "The glass cases were shattered from the inside. The labels were arranged to spell remember. Did we imagine that? Did the federal marshals imagine it when they documented the scene?" Mr. Phillips had no answer for this. He returned to his seat, and we were excused. The final witness was unexpected. Dr. Harrison from the asylum where Mr. Ashworth was being held. He testified that while Mr. Ashworth showed signs of mental deterioration, he also demonstrated clear memories of his actions and could articulate his motivations with disturbing clarity. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Harrison said, "Mr. Ashworth suffers from what I would term moral inscranatia, condition in which the capacity for empathy and ethical reasoning is absent, but intellectual function remains intact. He knew his actions were illegal and would be considered wrong by society. He simply did not believe those judgments applied to him." The trial concluded after 7 days. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Mrs. Morrison wept openly, supported by her husband. Other families of victims embraced each other, tears of relief and grief mingling together. Reporters rushed from the room to file their stories. Mr. Ashworth showed no reaction. He simply stared ahead, his expression blank, as though the verdict concerned someone else entirely. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment in the state penitentiary, to be held in isolation due to the nature of his crimes. He would die there, 8 years later, without ever expressing remorse or acknowledging the humanity of his victims. But that afternoon, as the judge's gavel fell, marking the end of the trial. I felt something shift in the air around us. The presences that had followed Naomi and me for months, the weight of the watching dead seemed to lift, not disappear entirely, but ease, like a held breath, finally released. They had their justice, limited though it was. They had their story told, their names spoken in a court of law, their deaths acknowledged as murders rather than scientific mishaps. They had been remembered as we left the courthouse, stepping into the spring sunshine. A reporter called out one final question. "Ruth, Naomi, do you still feel haunted by the victims?" I turned back, considering my answer carefully. "We are not haunted," I said finally. "We are accompanied, and we will carry them with us always, not as ghosts, but as reminders of what we survived, and what we must never allow to happen again." The reporter scribbled this down, and I knew it would appear in tomorrow's newspapers, probably alongside speculation about our sanity and the supernatural elements of the case. But I did not care what others believed. We knew the truth, and sometimes that is enough. 2 years have passed since the trial of Edmund Ashworth, and Wayfield has slowly returned to its ordinary rhythms. The scandal that once consumed every conversation has faded into history, referenced occasionally in whispered tones, but no longer the primary subject of town gossip. Naomi and I have grown into young women, though we remain inseparable in ways that go beyond mere sisterhood. Our gift has not diminished, though we have learned to control it better, to create boundaries when needed, while still maintaining the connection that defines us. We work now at the schoolhouse, assisting Mrs. Harrison with the younger children. It is good work, meaningful work, and it allows us to remain in Wayfield, despite the occasional sideways glances from those who still find us unsettling. But this is not truly the end of our story, or rather, it is not the end of the story we have become responsible for telling. In the autumn of 1874, Mrs. Morrison contacted us with a proposal. She had gathered the families of all the known victims, and together they had raised funds for a memorial. Would we help them design it? Would we ensure that the names of the lost were recorded properly, that their story was preserved? We agreed without hesitation. The memorial was erected in the cemetery at Grantville, where Abigail and Ann Thompson were buried in an unmarked plot after their remains were finally released to their family. It is a simple stone monument, perhaps 8 feet tall, with the names of all 14 children carved into its surface. 7 pairs of twins, whose lives were cut short by Edmund Ashworth's cruelty. At the top, we inscribed a single word, "Remember," and below the names, a message that Naomi and I composed together. These children possessed gifts that set them apart. They were taken because someone believed their uniqueness made them less than human, made them specimens rather than souls. We remember them not as victims, but as individuals who loved and were loved. May their names endure when their bodies could not. May their story prevent such darkness from ever rising again. The dedication ceremony was held on a grey November day, with most of the families in attendance. Pastor Fairmont spoke about loss and memory, and the responsibility of the living to honor the dead. Mrs. Morrison laid flowers at the base of the monument, her hands trembling but her voice steady as she spoke her daughters' names aloud. Then, one by one, the other families came forward. Each spoke a name, shared a memory, added their own flowers to the growing pile. When our turn came, Naomi and I stood together before the monument, our hands clasped as always. We did not speak for ourselves, but for all of them, the 14 whose names were carved in stone, and the others whose identities remained unknown, whose bodies were never found, whose families never learned what became of them. "We remember you," we said in unison, our voices carrying across the silent cemetery. "You are not forgotten. You are not alone, and we promise to keep telling your story for as long as we draw breath." As we spoke, I felt it, a warmth in the cold air, a sense of presence without threat, not haunting, not possession, but acknowledgement, a connection reaching across the boundary of death, saying, "Yes, thank you, remember." Then it faded, leaving only the wind and the grey sky, and the names carved in stone. We returned to Wayfield that evening, and for the first time in 2 years, I slept without dreams of glass cases and preserved hearts. The presences that had accompanied us since that terrible night had finally, fully, departed, but the memory remains. I continue this journal now as a record, not just of what we endured, but of what we learned. There are lessons here that extend beyond our particular story, that gifts which set people apart can make them vulnerable to those who see difference as something to exploit rather than celebrate. that poverty and desperation can lead families to accept situations that instinct warns against, because survival often requires gambling with safety, that evil can wear the mask of respectability, can hide behind education and wealth and scientific authority, that the vulnerable, particularly children, particularly those who are different, require protection and advocacy, because they cannot always protect themselves, and most importantly, that the dead deserve to be remembered not as statistics or specimens or cautionary tales, but as individuals who lived and loved and mattered. Naomi and I carry this knowledge with us always. Our gift, which once made us targets, has become a form of witnessing. We are connected not just to each other, but to all those who came before us, whose lives became entangled with ours through tragedy. Some in Wayfield still avoid us, uncomfortable with what we represent. Others have come to see us as a living memorial, a reminder of what was prevented as much as what was lost. We saved no one, we came too late for that, but we exposed the evil, gave voice to the voiceless, and ensured that the story would be told. That is not nothing that as I write these final words, Naomi sits beside me at our shared desk, copying out the list of names one more time. We do this regularly, write them down, speak them aloud, keep them present in our daily lives. It is a small ritual, but it feels necessary. Abigail and Anne Thompson, the Chen sisters, whose first names we never learned, and all the others whose identities remain. Mysteries. We remember them. We will always remember them, and perhaps, in remembering, we honor not just their deaths, but their brief, bright lives, the gifts they possessed, the connections they shared, the love they knew before darkness found them. This is what survives: memory, testimony, the commitment to ensure that such things never happen again. It is not enough, but it is what we have, and so we continue, Naomi and I, connected as always, carrying the stories of the lost, living our lives in the shadow of what was taken but also in the light of what we preserved. The past does not die, it lives on in those who remember. And we remember. Always. This journal was discovered among the papers of Ruth Michaels following her death in 1927. She and her sister Naomi lived their entire lives in Wayfield, never marrying, dedicating themselves to education and advocacy for vulnerable children. The memorial they helped create still stands in Grantville Cemetery, though the names carved upon it have weathered with time. The story they preserved, however impossible it may sound to modern ears, remains a testament to both the darkness humans are capable of and the courage required to bring that darkness into the light. Whether one believes the supernatural elements of their account or dismisses them as the embellishments of traumatized minds, the fundamental truth remains: 14 children died at the hands of Edmund Ashworth, and Ruth and Naomi Michaels ensured that their deaths were neither ignored nor forgotten. This, ultimately, is the legacy that endures. The E&D. If this story moved you, remember that history is filled with voices that nearly went unheard, with victims whose names were almost lost. Consider subscribing to hear more forgotten accounts recovered from the archives of time. Where are you watching from? Share in the comments. We love connecting with viewers around the world who help keep these stories alive.